Have you ever wondered what it would have been like if we woke up in a different universe where Stan Lee didn't create Marvel's biggest superheroes, and instead worked for DC? In today's video, we're going to be discussing just that. Because in 2001, we got to see what an alternate reality would have held for us, and all we had to do was just imagine. Stan Lee is most famous for creating, basically, all of the Marvel Universe that we know right now, minus characters like Captain America. Stan Lee created characters like Spider-Man, the Hulk, the Fantastic Four, heck, even the X-Men.
Alright, let's everybody just calm the f*** down.
But what if he created characters like Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, and even brought them all together in their own version of Justice League? In 2001, Stan Lee finally bridged the gap between himself, Marvel, and the distinguished competition. Over the last 80 years, dozens, if not hundreds of comic book writers and artists had swapped places between Marvel and DC. Whether it be Jim Lee, who most famously drew the reboot of X-Men in the 90s, before leaving to co-create Image Comics with other famous Marvel creators, like Todd McFarlane, and technically I guess Rob Liefeld, but seriously, that dude can't draw feet, and good lord have you looked at his new version of Captain America. Before going over and becoming the new publisher at DC, or even Jack the King Kirby, who left Marvel and created characters for DC like Darkseid and the New Gods. But when Stan went to go to DC, he wouldn't just create new characters that could be used in perpetuity by the distinguished competition.
No! None of that! Shame on you!
In fact, what he ended up doing was recreating and reimagining the tentpole characters over at DC, giving them the Marvel treatment, and changing who they were on a fundamental level, giving them an entirely new histories, and even names. These characters were reimagined from the ground up, whether it be the new Batman, who once was known as Bruce Wayne, but is now Wayne Williams, or even the reimagined Wonder Woman, now named Maria Mendoza.
Okay.
Oh, hey, would you look at that? Stan Lee's trademark alliteration. If you haven't noticed it before, go back and look at some of Marvel's characters that Stan created, and it'll stick out like a sore thumb. Just gonna rapid fire a couple for you, just so you're aware of them.
3, 2, 1, go!
Peter Parker, Reed Richards, Richard Rider, Sue Storm, Otto Octavius, Scott Summers, Matt Murdock, and even more.
Hey Stan, you really do like making alliterative names, don't you?
Once you notice this, you'll never be able to unsee it. I'm so sorry. Starting off with Batman, Stan Lee basically changed everything about the character except for his alias, Batman. Instead of Batman being Bruce Wayne, obviously now he's Wayne Williams. Instead of being a rich Caucasian boy whose father was a doctor, he's now a lower middle class African American boy whose father was a police officer. Instead of both of his parents being gunned down by a criminal, only his father was. Instead of Bruce Wayne spending the rest of his life from that moment that his parents were taken from him to train to be Batman and the best hero he could be, Williams was framed for a crime he didn't commit and sent to prison, where he swears to get revenge on the gang leader who sent him there and ended up taking his mother from him.
Excuse me, what?
But honestly, the biggest shock for me is how Wayne Williams ends up becoming the person who is able to fund all of his excursions as Batman. Unlike Bruce, he wasn't born into a wealthy family, so he becomes a professional wrestler. I wonder where we've seen that before. Anyway, this version of Batman makes his living as a professional wrestler without ever revealing his identity. That way, giving him the ability to live a normal life as Wayne Williams, as well as making his fortune as Batman. And he ends up confronting the person who got him locked away in the first place, sending him down the path that he is now, who also may or may not have killed his mother. And that person was a gang leader named Hands, with a Z. Anyway, this version of Batman was able to track down and take down Hands, but in the process the villain perished, leaving Batman guilt-ridden and still full of purpose, pushing him to go beyond this gang leader and clean up the streets of his city in a non-lethal way. Obviously, you can see the core tenets of Batman still ring true in this version, but in reality, it's completely different from what we saw before. kind of unique. And honestly, it's a fresh take on a character who at this point was 60 years old. Good lord, I can't believe this came out 22 years ago. It's also important to note that this comic was illustrated by Joe Kubert, who has an illustrious career with both Marvel and DC, dating all the way back to basically the inception of comics. He worked on the comic book that brought Superman back from the golden age of comics into the silver, otherwise known as Earth 2 Superman. He was the artist behind the first appearance of Ragman for DC Comics, as well as a key contributor to some early Flash comic books, such as issue 88, which is the first appearance of Gentleman Ghost, and the third appearance of Black Canary. He even worked on the final Flash comic from the Golden Age, before it was rebooted with Barry Allen, where they retold the origin of Jay Garrick and introduced a character known as the Rival, which is widely considered to be a test run at the Reverse Flash. Joe Kubert has accomplished much more than that in the history of comic books, but that could be a story for another time. Plus, there are many artists that Stan Lee decided to bring in for these unique reimaginings of classic DC heroes, such as the next character, that being Stan Lee's just imagined version of Superman. Unlike his 1938 counterpart, this version of Superman was not a child sent from a dying planet to survive on Earth. In fact, he was a Kryptonian cop, and one of the worst ones at that. He ends up tracking down a criminal in a lab developing teleportation, and after an altercation, both of them end up getting sent to Earth. They end up arriving in separate locations due to their scuffle, with the villain landing in a jungle civilization which he quickly conquers, due to his newfound abilities from being on planet Earth, with Superman, otherwise known as Sal Din, arriving far, far away. Obviously, this is kind of mirroring the relationship that Superman has with General Zod, being two of the only survivors of his race. However, in this iteration, Krypton's still fine. And instead of being the last son of Krypton, this version of Superman's main motivation, instead of becoming a peacekeeper of the new planet he calls home, is to develop civilization far enough and advanced enough that could send him home to see his people. I'm kinda okay with this version of Superman. Just the idea of having Krypton actually be a goal and not just having it be a vague, nebulous idea that makes him want to keep the peace, being his main driving motive, is pretty cool. Also, having another member of his species who he is fundamentally opposed to being trapped on the same planet as him is an interesting concept, considering that would be the only other person who has any kind of recollection or desire to return to their home. However, this version of Superman is not as pure or ideologically driven as his counterpart from the main continuity. This version of Superman, Sal Din, decides he wants to mold humanity into what he needs it to be in order to develop fast enough to get him the technology to go home. Of course, this isn't exactly a selfless reason to become a superhero, but it's a strong enough motivator, I suppose. Definitely a far cry from truth, justice, and the American way that we've had since the 1930s. Ever since Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel created the Big Blue Boy Scout as a representation of core American values and determination. This version of Superman was actually illustrated by John Buscema, who is an incredibly talented artist, and most known for his Silver Age work. For Marvel, he was an artist behind the creation of Red Guardian, who you may recognize from the Black Widow movie, and soon to be the Thunderbolts. He was also the artist responsible for introducing both Ultron and Vision to Marvel Comics. He was the one who made Ant-Man, the Hank Pym version, become Yellow Jacket, and even drew the origin comic for Black Panther. He even created the design for Nebula from Guardians of the Galaxy, and drew the first version of the Council of Kangs. He even drew the comic called Kang Dynasty. He was an incredibly prolific comic book artist, creating not only those comics, but he also created the reintroduction of Submariner into the Silver Age of comics, with Submariner #1. He even did the first co-published work between Marvel and DC, that being The Wizard of Oz, which I actually just released a video going over the entirety of Marvel and DC's crossovers in comics, and if we could see that again in the future, in live action. So go ahead and give it a watch after you finish this one. The link will be in the description below. With this comic, it's fair to say that Stan Lee was absolutely drawing some heavy hitters into the fold, in terms of comic book art royalty. But who will he have come in to round out the holy trinity of DC characters? The final character we'll touch on in today's video will be DC's reimagined version of Wonder Woman. In this version, instead of being Princess Diana from Themyscira or even Paradise Island, we have Maria Mendoza. This version of the character is one of the most different, considering there is no ties to any kind of Greek gods or a different origin. Instead, This character was just a normal human, an activist protesting against a corrupt corporation who planned on excavating ancient Incan ruins and wanted to preserve her heritage. You know, bit of a far cry from Zeus's daughter or even being made of clay on an island of just warrior women. Never seeing any men and training every day just to be a warrior. But to each their own, I guess. Maria Mendoza protests the excavation due to it being an ancient Incan holy site near her home. The villain of this story is actually a CEO named Armando Gutierrez, who apparently somehow knew that these ancient ruins held magical powers and would be able to give him power to take over the world. How he knows that? God only knows. Or Stan Lee only knows, I suppose. So maybe the one above all. Except for, that's Jack Kirby in the Marvel Universe. And this is DC. Anyways, I'm just rambling now. The CEO ends up kidnapping Maria's father, which I don't know why, but I guess it gets results because Maria goes to rescue her father, but she arrives too late as her father had already passed away. And with his death, the CEO, Armando Gutierrez, gains demonic powers from an ancient Incan artifact at the excavation site. Which, if you think about it, is kind of nuts because Stan Lee's tapping into the stereotype of ancient Mesoamerican civilizations doing some kind of ritualistic sacrifice in order to gain powers from gods. But, alright, I guess that's one way to get powers. Armando then travels back to Los Angeles, as a CEO would naturally do. At this point, Maria finds another artifact that Armando didn't know about, which is an ancient Incan staff of a sun god, known as the Staff of Manco Capac, who actually was a real person in the ancient Incan civilization of Cusco.
Booyah! Welcome to Cusco-topia.
Anyway, somehow that ended up giving her the power of the sun god, which of course she uses to go to Los Angeles, track down the guy who killed her father, and extract revenge. After doing so, she ends up staying in Los Angeles, deeming it her new home, and taking the name Wonder Woman. Although I do think that this one is kind of funny, it's definitely not as good as the original. However, I do think it's incredible that it was drawn by Jim Lee.
No relation.
Who is now the publisher at DC, running the entire comic book side of the business, while James Gunn handles the creative side of the films. And the fact that Jim Lee is one of the most interesting artists that could have been attached to this project, considering he was responsible for the explosion of X-Men in the 90s, with the reboot and his classic issue #1 covers, which basically birthed the idea of collectors having to get multiple copies of the same comic in order to make sure they had every variant, as well as the fact that he was a co-founder of Image Comics. This guy's basically had his hand in all three of the biggest comic book publishers ever made, and he chose to work with Stan the Man on this reimagining of Wonder Woman. Stan Lee would go on to create even more versions of classic DC Comics characters through his Just Imagine series, and they even culminated in their own JLA, and even had their own version of Crisis. Which, it's not really the same, but still very interesting. In total, there were 13 individual issues and different stories, each one of them introducing and focusing on one new character or group. For example, we haven't even discussed characters yet like Robin, The Flash, the Sandman, even Catwoman. So if you'd like to see me go further in depth into these other characters, as well as discuss the artist that brought them to the page, go ahead and let me know down below if you would like to see a part 2. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please go ahead and leave a like as it really does help, and subscribe for more. If you want to see more from me, go ahead and click here to see the insane stories about Marvel and DC crossing over with each other, and how they may cross over with each other again in live action. Or here to see the DC Comics characters that I think would be able to absolutely solo the Avengers starting lineup. I hope you have a great day, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one.